Well, it's time for us to begin. If you'll notice, there is just a change in the formatting on the screen behind us. Some gremlin jumped into the system, and we don't know exactly what's going on between the projector and the screen. Hopefully, everybody can see it if the formats have not changed any. But tonight, we're going to continue our studies in the books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And as you know, and several have mentioned, we have a number of different chapters to cover, both in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And we're going to really be focusing our attention on the kings of the south, kings of Judah. Last week, when we looked in 2 Kings chapter 17, we saw how the last king of the north, Hoshea, was taken captive by the Assyrian nation, and then the Assyrian nation besieged the capital city of Samaria, and the people were deported, relocated, if you will, thus ending the 10 northern tribes, or the reign of the kings of the 10 northern tribes. And all we have left at this point, at least from the focus of our writers to some degree, is the kings of the south. Last week, we did begin that by looking at Ahaz. We're going to continue by looking at the reign of his son Hezekiah, and then his reign is followed up by his son Manasseh. This week, the next two classes, we're going to be focusing our attention on Hezekiah. And we've not really done that for any of the kings in this study, except for Solomon, we spent 3 classes on, and Ahab, we spent 2. But we're going to slow down now and just focus in on the reign of King Hezekiah. And the reason we kind of do that, as we're going to look at his reign, I jumped ahead of myself, just so you know, that is one of the seals of King Hezekiah, or a bulla, that was found in 2015 in a garbage dump outside the Temple Mount. And on this little seal that King Hezekiah would use to authenticate his documentation, it has 2 Ankhs and 2 suns, or winged suns, on it. And it has this statement at the bottom. It says, belonging to Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah. I just put that up there because one of the fascinating things about this reign is probably the archaeological evidence for this king and his reign, and the people that he interacts with is probably greater than many of the other kings that we've looked at. I mean, the fact is we can see documentation from the Assyrians and Sennacherib. We can look at the Taylor prison specifically for that. We can look at bust of his interaction with the Babylonians. And on down the line, we have all kinds of archaeological information about this king and his reign. But the reason we're going to spend 2 weeks on Hezekiah is because it seems, through God's perspective and the writers that he's chose to reveal his reign, he places a great deal of emphasis on Hezekiah. I mean, you think about there's 3 chapters dedicated to his reign in 2 Kings. In 2 Chronicles, there's 4. And even in the prophet Isaiah, there's 4 chapters at least given to the reign of this king. And the question I kind of ask myself, why does God give so much emphasis to this king when he's passed over the reigns of people like Omri or others in just a few short verses? Why does he want us to focus in on King Hezekiah? And the text doesn't really tell us. But I'll offer a couple of suggestions to you just to think about. First of all, I think in some ways, the reign of King Hezekiah and the tenure he has in Judah is at a critical point in the people's history. We just looked at Assyria comes in and takes the northern tribes away. And the question often is, in the reader's mind, is Judah next? And the fact is if they continued down the path that Ahaz laid for them, we don't know how soon that Babylon would have come in. I mean, based on God's foreknowledge, he knew. But I mean, if they continued in the way of Ahaz, who knows? The second thing, I think it's emphasized in this text, is the power of one man's desire to reform or bring people back to God. So much of the reign of Hezekiah is like the great reformers of old, where we talk about Jehoshaphat, or later on we're going to talk about Josiah. But Hezekiah is in that same stamp where he tries his best, he's convicted, to bring the people's attention back to God. He tries to reverse the course of his wicked father Ahaz, and he sends people's attention back to God. I think that's a reason that there's so much focus giving on Hezekiah. But one other one is, I think, is kind of interesting. One of the reasons I think that so much attention is given to Hezekiah is because I think it's emphasizing God's blessing. The fact is when you read the books of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, I'm just going to tell you, more often than not, what do we see? We see God bringing judgment, God bringing punishment, or trying to catch the people's attention. And because what they have chosen to turn away from God and follow false idols and live for themselves, God has judged them accordingly. But the flip side is true as well. God doesn't want to send judgment on his people. God doesn't want his people to suffer. The fact is, God wants to bless. And we see people, when they turn their hearts back to God and do what's right, that's exactly what he does. And in King Hezekiah's reign, we see that. We see this nature of God. God is not just a God of judgment, but he's a God of blessing. And he wants to bless people if they turn to seek him in their lives. So I want to begin, and this is going to be kind of dry, but I do want to begin with this because I think there's an important point to be made about this. And that's to think about the dates of King Hezekiah's reign. I put up earlier these dates, 715 to 686, okay? And I'm just going to tell you right up front, that's a pretty good guess. But those dates for King Hezekiah's reign are pretty contested. The fact of the matter is that, let's read of where it says that in 2 Kings chapter 18 and verses 1 and 2 when it introduces King Hezekiah. It says this, "Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abi or Abijah, that's her shortened name, the daughter of Zechariah." Now, when you think about those dates given, here's what some people say about this. They say, perhaps the naughtiest of all scriptural chronological problems occurs in this chapter. Despite the many ingenious attempts to resolve these difficulties, the harmonizations of this dates or data remains a thorny problem. The fact is when Hezekiah ruled and how he interrelates with Hoshea in the reign of his son Manasseh is a difficult problem to solve. Most people begin his date of his sole regency, his reign, at 715. And the reason they do that is really two main factors. One, they looked at the events in the north when Hoshea and Assyria came in and took Hoshea and Samaria and the people captive. The second is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 13 when Assyria invades Judah. Based upon Assyrian records, that happened in about 701 BC. So they kind of do some math and they say his sole reign began in 715. But the challenge is, how does that relate to Hoshea? He came to begin to reign when Hoshea's 3rd year. Hoshea was already taken captive. You look at his 29-year reign and you look at the reign of Manasseh. Well, what's the solution? I'm going to offer you one just to kind of think about, and then I want to make my point. And here's what someone suggested, and I think it's a reasonable suggestion. Hezekiah began reigning as his father Ahaz's vice-regent in 729 BC and ruled as such for 14 years. In 715 BC, he began his sole rule over Judah that lasted until 697, 18 years. Then he reigned with his son Manasseh, who served as his vice-regent for 11 more years. You go, that's pretty dry. Do I need to know that? And I don't expect you to remember that. But the fact is, when you have people who are antagonistic toward the biblical story, who don't believe in the Bible or they're opposed to God, these are the types of issues that they often point to. They say, hey, we can't know when Hezekiah ruled. It's all a fabrication. Or the fact is, it's 3 or 4 stories all jumbled together. See, this is not real history. And the point is, what I want you to see just with this suggestion, that may not be accurate. Maybe there's another explanation out there. But there's a reasonable suggestion how to explain these differences in math. We look at when they came to the throne, their co-regency. We look at their year of ascension and all of these information. So if somebody comes to you and says, Andy, we can't believe the Bible because, look, they got all the dates wrong about King Hezekiah. Andy's going to go, well, I don't know. I don't know when Hezekiah reigned. But the fact of the matter is there are reasonable explanations for these things. You know, one of the battles we face as Christians is sometimes when someone confronts us very strongly, it's very easily to be intimidated. And when they confront you strongly, all the facts and data you have just kind of float out the window. It happens to me all the time. But the fact is we just need to stop for just a moment and think. There are reasonable explanations, even if we can't prove them to a certainty, that would go to explain some of these numerical or chronological issues. But the thing I want us to start thinking about is just Hezekiah's reign in general. He came to rule as a young man at 26. Based upon our study of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, and based upon who his father is, what kind of king would you have expected Hezekiah to be? Yeah. I mean, what have we seen? What's been the biblical record down through the... What happens when young men assume the throne and they don't have guidance? Think about Rehoboam. What happened to his kingship? It takes an abrupt ride. And the fact is we don't have any named counselor associated with Hezekiah, at least in the biblical text. No one had identified who's closely linked to him. Furthermore, he grew up in a household. At least his father Ahaz was extremely antagonistic or wicked or self-serving. And so we often would expect Hezekiah to go down that reign. So I'm just going to tell you, when you read the story of Hezekiah right off the bat, you ought to go, wow. This young man at the age of 26, when he assumed the throne, chose to live a different kind of life. He chose to live different than his father did. And I would suggest to you he probably did have counselors. Because the fact of the matter is when we look at Hezekiah's reign, two different prophets were involved in his reign. If you go to Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 1, Isaiah the prophet was active during the reign of King Hezekiah. It wrote the vision of Isaiah the son of Amos concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which he saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. But it wasn't just Isaiah. Anybody know another prophet that was active during the reign of King Hezekiah? Micah. So we go to Micah chapter 1 and verse 1. Here's what it says. The word of the Lord which came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, in which he saw regarding Samaria and Jerusalem. So we have two active agents of God's will being expressed. Both of these prophets who, especially in the case of Isaiah, have warned Hezekiah. And I would suggest to you have probably been as, in some regard, his conscience going forward. And so right off the bat, we're struck by this man at the age of 26, contrary to all he knew in his father's household. Maybe his mother was godly, I don't know. But at least in his father's perspective, he listened to the word of God. He wanted to seek God. And his whole life was different. And not just a little bit, was it? I mean, it wasn't just he was a little better than Ahaz in that regard. Because the text really makes plain how God regarded his reign and as a person. Look at 2 Kings chapter 18 and just note verse 3 and verse 6. 2 Kings 18, verse 3 and verse 6. It said, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord in accordance with everything that his father David had done. For he clung to the Lord. He did not desist from following him, but kept his commandments which the Lord had commanded Moses. I mean, that's how God describes his reign, his rule, and him as a person. And it begins by measuring against King David, right? King David, who basically is the standard in 1st and 2nd Kings and even 1st and 2nd Samuel of what a man after God's own heart, a godly ruler would look like. And he said he did everything according that his father David had done. You know how many other kings that's said about? No. I mean, to some regard, you got Asa and Jehoshaphat and maybe Josiah. But to him, you could argue from a different perspective. But this, of all the kings we've looked at, this is the only one that God said that about. And why did he say that? Because it said he clung to the Lord. That word clung is like he affixed himself to. The Old Testament, we use the word cleave. That's what he did. He cleaved to the Lord. Whatever else, he clung to the Lord. He didn't trust in princes or horses or things of that nature. He continued to clung to the Lord. And he didn't desist from following him. I mean, that word is like you start on a straight line. He didn't go to the right or the left. He didn't alter his course. And so Hezekiah is held up as this figure. And he's just worthy of our emulation. Because he clung to the Lord, he did not desist from following it, and he kept his commandments. And that's really emphasized in the book of Chronicles. The book of Chronicles has the 4 chapters about Hezekiah, and there's an interesting pattern that you find in the book of Chronicles that kind of goes like this. Each section of Chronicles, each major section that deals with Hezekiah is introduced by a statement that talks about Hezekiah's value or how he appears to the Lord. Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and look at verses 1 and 2. Again, this is kind of a parallel text to what we looked at, but it begins this section. It says, Hezekiah became king when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father had done. And that really begins to introduce the next 3 chapters, 29, 30, and 31. At the end of chapter 31, we get another statement like that. Chapter 31, beginning verses 20 and 21. Thus Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and he did what was good, right, and true before the Lord his God. Every work which he began in the service of the house of the God in law and in commandment, seeking his God, he did with all his heart. And he prospered. And that kind of introduces chapter 32 and the events with Sennacherib and how he begins to besiege Jerusalem. But then we move to the end of his life in chapter 32 and verse 30, especially there in that text, where it begins to talk about his building the tunnel or stopping the water. It was Hezekiah who stopped the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all that he did. Why? Because he made it his decision to follow the Lord. And we don't see that. I mean, that's kind of like King Solomon back in 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 11. Why was Solomon so successful? Well, he was smart. He was rich. No, because early on he chose to follow the Lord. And because he chose to follow the Lord, he was blessed. So the chronicler kind of catalogs for us Hezekiah's reign. So, what's the first big event in Hezekiah's life? What's the first thing that the writers want us to focus on? What's the first thing we need to know about him and his rule? Is it the fact he's facing lots of enemies? What's the very first thing we're focused on? Yeah. The very first thing that we note about Hezekiah is his desire to reform the worship to God. The fact is, as you look in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 3, notice what it says. In the first year of his reign and in the first month. So the very first thing that Hezekiah did, at least from the perspective of the writers, is focus on these reforms. What would you do if you became king? I mean, I don't know about you. I would solidify my rule. I would make sure I got my cabinet in place. I would make sure I got my appropriate advisors scheduled. What would I do? I would be worried about Assyria. Are they going to swoop down and come down further? All of these different things that would draw our attention. The very first thing the writer wants us to focus on about Hezekiah is that he sought the Lord and wanted the people of God to seek the Lord. That's the very first thing. The first year of the first month. Okay? So right off the bat, that's what he begins to do. Now, in the book of 2 Kings, we've got just a few verses. But in 2 Chronicles, 3 chapters, are taken up basically with these reforms. 3 chapters. And that says a couple of things, right? First of all, they needed a lot of work. I mean, because they had fallen so far away from God's standard under the reigns of Ahaz and the successive kings, they were a long way away from where God wanted them to be. But the second thing it says about Hezekiah is he was thorough. And he was concerned about, from A to Z, about focusing people's attention upon God. And he doesn't seem really concerned about if it ruffles any feathers. This is what we need to be doing as God's people. So, as we look at the reforms, I don't know how well you can see this, but this is just kind of an overview of some of the reforms. I mean, he removed the high places. He destroyed Moses' bronze serpent, apparently, which had been carried forward or reintroduced. He reopened the doors of the temple. They brought out of the courtyard everything that was unclean and carried it out to the Kidron Valley. They purified the temple of the Lord. They purified the altar of the burnt offering. They purified the table for setting out the consecrated bread. They consecrated the priest. They set in place back to how people could give and how it would go to the temple and the upkeep of the temple of God. All kinds of reforms that he set out. And so what I want us to do in our time together is just kind of pick some things out of this that ought to stand out to us about reform. Because the fact of the matter is, we're always ought to be in the process of reforming. We ought to be making sure that we're bringing ourselves close to God. And I think there's a lot of neat things in these 3 chapters that we ought to bring out. So, with that being said, what stands out to you all about the reforms that are just any of the ideas that are there in those 3 chapters? Andy? Okay.
We had so many kings that struggled with getting to that point because I think they were concerned politically.
Okay. So he removed the high places. And not only that, at the end of the text, you know who goes out and does it too? The people. The people, after the Passover, they come together and worship God. It's not only King Hezekiah leading the charge, but when people see someone going ahead of them and they see themselves before God, they go too. And they went out throughout the land destroying the Asherim and all the other things that stood in the place of true worship to God. Wayne, did you have your hand up? Or I saw somebody. Aura?
I would want to ask, it says the mother was the daughter of Zechariah. Is that the Zechariah that we hear about more often, or is it just a Zechariah that's, if it was the prophet, one of the prophets?
I don't believe it is the daughter of the prophet, okay? But who it is exactly, I don't know. The text never really gives me a lineage that I'm aware of that further identifies her with any specificity. That prophet came a little later in time. I don't believe it is the daughter of the prophet. But beyond that, I don't know the answer to that question. Somebody else. I thought somebody else had their hand up. Well, I want to bring just a few things up in this text, just for your consideration. And the very first thing, he opened the doors of the temple. That's the very first thing it said, one of the very first things that he did. In 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 3, It says, in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and he repaired them. Well, to open them, that means they had to be closed, right? So back in chapter 28, verse 24, when we read about his father, look what his father had done. Moreover, when Ahaz gathered together the utensils of the house of God, he cut the utensils of the house of God into pieces, and he closed the doors of the house of the Lord and made altars for himself in every corner of Jerusalem. The very first thing, I just find that striking. The very first thing that Hezekiah did was to open the doors of the temple because he knew that people needed to draw near to God and they needed to be together to worship God. The very first thing that he did was to open the doors. Now, you could argue maybe this is not chronological because he doesn't go about cleansing the temple till later. But the very first thing he does is to open the doors to no longer have a barrier between the people and God, that they could draw near to God. I think that's important. That's what he starts off with. Now, I'm going to keep going. Anybody got anything, just wave your hands. Go. So, the second thing is struck me. Before he started cleansing the temple, he had the people cleanse themselves, right? Look at 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and look at verses 4 and 5 when he talked about the priests and the Levites. It says in the first, he brought in the priests and the Levites and gathered them into the square of the east. Then he said to me, listen to me, O Levites, consecrate yourselves now. Consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry the uncleanness out from the holy place. Before they set about cleaning in the temple, you got that conjunction and. You could almost put then, because it seems almost sequentially. They first cleansed themselves before they set about cleansing the temple of God. And I think that's important. I mean, what did God teach in Leviticus chapter 10 to Nadab and Abihu? How would God be treated? You had to be holy when you approach God. Can you think of any New Testament examples of that? What about in Matthew chapter 7 when we're judging our own brother? What are you supposed to do first? Look at yourself, right? It all begins here. Before I'm going to approach God, before I'm going to do service to God, I've got to first cleanse myself. And I think Hezekiah starts that way. Priests and Levites, cleanse yourself. And then cleanse the temple of God. Wayne?
In the story of Nadab and Abihu, God said, by those who approach me, I must be considered as holy.
Absolutely. And so they're going to approach him with a contrite and lowly heart, a heart that's pure and clean. And so they set about cleansing themselves first. I think it's important that we see in the midst of these reforms is an acknowledgement of sin. Boyd, go. Did you want to make a point on that previous one before we go? Go ahead.
The interesting thing is the Levites obeyed the commandment to sanctify themselves, but the priests did not.
Yeah, we're going to see that in just a minute, right? So apparently, he called upon them to do that, and the Levites responded in greater numbers. Some of the priests did, but there were so few priests who chose to consecrate themselves or they drugged their feet. That was one of the reasons given. They weren't able to offer the Passover at the appropriate time. Yeah, good point, boy. But I think in the midst of these reforms, there's an acknowledgement of sin. And you go, well, what's the big deal about that? I'll tell you what's the big deal about that. Sometimes the most zealous reformers sometimes fail to focus inside themselves and realize they have been part of the problem. And I mean, Hezekiah acknowledges their sins before God. He begins with his fathers, and as you look at beginning in verse 6, for our fathers have been unfaithful and have done evil in the sight of the Lord our God. He goes on down in verse 8, the wrath of the Lord was against Judah and Jerusalem. And then he talks about how they have reaped these consequences. Our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity for this. Hezekiah realizes the place that they're in is precarious before the Lord. that the wrath that God has shown them through the efforts of these other nations against them is just. And so we not only want to cleanse our hearts and recognize our sin before them, but also change how we approach you. He acknowledges his sin. I think it's neat in verse 11. How does he speak to the Levites? Look at verse 11. How does he address the Levites there down in verse 11? My sons, do not be negligent now. When you call someone a son, do you get a sense of encouragement about that? The fact of the matter is they've been through a rough time. If anybody wanted to live godly and they lived under the reign of King Ahaz, or they're being called upon to change, I see in this tenor of King Hezekiah, he's not only calling upon them, admonishing them, exhorting them, he's also encouraging them to change. Sons, do not be negligent. As a father pleading to someone. I think that is neat. He's the king. Do this. No, he pleads with them. And I think that's sometimes what we need to do in the midst of a reform. Plead with people to not grow weary in doing good. Or, I don't care how bad you get back into the fight. Whatever the case may be, sons, do not be negligent. Does this stand out to anybody? He decided to reinstitute the Passover, and who did he invite? Anybody, come. And there's a couple of implications associated with that. First of all, that would suggest that the rule of the Assyrians over the northern 10 tribes was not ironclad, so they could leave wherever they're located. And furthermore, it suggests that not all of the people of the north had been deported or resettled. But he sent out this invitation to everyone to worship God, to come and participate in the Passover. Now, they were going to take advantage of the allowance that God made, and they were going to observe it in the second month. The reason was because, remember, he started doing this in the first month, and they didn't get done till the 18th, and the Passover was supposed to start on the 14th, so they missed it before he got everything done. But they invited everyone. You know what Hezekiah is doing here? He's trying to create reconciliation amongst all his brethren. They've been divided since the time of Rehoboam and Jeroboam, back in 1 Kings. They've been divided this whole time. And he says, the Lord is so important. I don't care what's going on behind us. We're brethren. We need to come together and offer worship to God. I think this is a call for reconciliation. Now, some met him with derision and scorn, but some others accepted and came and participated in the worship. He sets about removing the altars of the false gods. You know, that altar that Ahaz copied and set up, that was removed. But and he cleared it out, and then that's also, he cleared out the high places, and then he destroyed this, what this text calls the Nehushtan, I guess. That was the fiery serpent, the bronze serpent that was raised up on a pole when the fiery serpents came into the camp back in the book of Numbers. It's kind of questioning to me if they carried it along with them this whole time or they recreated it. I don't know. But whatever it was, the cure became the point of worship. And so they called this thing the Nehushtan. It's a word apparently in Hebrew, and I don't speak Hebrew, but this is the sources I read. That sounds similar to a snake, a piece of bronze, and what else? What else does it say it's similar to? And it's also an unclean thing. So it's kind of it's a word. It's not the specific word for the text, but it's almost a play on words. That's what this thing was. And you know, he took this piece of metal that was an object of their worship and turned it into scrap. He got rid of it. I don't know, did that one ever strike you? It was the object of God's deliverance, and they began to worship the thing instead of the one who actually provided the deliverance. I mean, the thing became worse than the fiery serpents almost, or became equal to it. It was leading the people away from God. And so just think about these as you look at, I mean, there's all kinds of other ones. I mean, you look down in chapter 29 and verse 25, how they reformed. What did they do? Where did they seek? When he began to do the music, in verse 25, they did according to the command of David, of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for the command was from the Lord through his prophet. If you want to reform worship, you want to reform, you got to go back to the source. If you want to please God, you go back to the source with what the Lord commanded. Or you look at verse 34 of chapter 29 when Boyd made mention of this earlier. But the priests were too few so that they were unable to skin all the burnt offerings. Therefore their brothers, the Levites, helped them until the work was completed and until the other priests had consecrated themselves. For the Levites were more conscientious or upright of heart to consecrate themselves than the priest. And I think that's just puzzling, but I think it's also insightful. Is everybody, when you choose to turn back to the Lord or institute something or try to accomplish something, does everybody always come along with you? They don't, do they? And that's a warning to us. Even though the priests hadn't done what they should have done, the Levites made sure they were consecrated. Not everybody's going to go along with you. So I want to just ask one question, though, as we think about these reforms. And it's this. Why is that the first thing Hezekiah did? I mean, you got Assyria breathing down your neck. I mean, they just taken the northern tribes away. You know the threat was real. So why do you begin with reform? Because the fact of the matter, from a worldly perspective, that seems to be the last thing you ought to do. You ought to be rallying your military forces. You ought to be preparing provision. You shouldn't be starting these religious reforms, because all it does, it's not going to unite the people. It's going to create upheaval in many cases. Why would you start there? And I'll leave you with this quote. He says, when there is a financial crisis, the first thing we think about is money. When there's a communication crisis, our prime concern is to learn how to talk the language of the modern generation. When there's a church attendance crisis, we make it our chief aim to get numbers up. If Hezekiah had responded to a military threat in a military way, the Assyrians would have understood that. Army would have been matched against army with dire consequences for Judah. But instead, he and the people first look up to God. Because it is God's the only way they're going to be preserved. And the only way that they're going to succeed and their nation will remain. Hezekiah wasn't overlooking the fact that Assyria was breathing down its neck. He just knew the only source of strength that he really had was God. And he needed to first make that relationship right before he did anything else. And that seems to me why the start of his reign begins this way. So, thoughts? Anybody want to throw another one in there? Barb?
Well, I thought in 2 Chronicles 38:16-20, where people were going to eat the Passover but had not sanctified themselves.
Yeah.
I just thought where Hezekiah prayed for them, made a good word for life for everyone. There's a sort of seek God, the Lord God his fathers, though he is not cleansed according to the purification of sanctuary. And the Lord listened to Hezekiah, healed people. And so I would think, first of all, they weren't doing it the way they should because they hadn't been doing it. And that's a really hard thing, when you stop and think about it. If you've just been doing what's wrong,
After generations, it takes a while.
But he prayed.
I really liked also where it, instead of using the word forgiven, it said the Lord healed them. Healed their breach, healed their relationship, and used that as the way God's responded to their seeking him. He healed them. I think that's a cool picture as well. I mean, anybody else? Boyd? Yeah. Well, so Numbers chapter 9, is that right? Numbers chapter 9. There was provision made for the second month versus the first month that was given by God. And so God made that provision as well. Okay. Well,
One other thing, I found it interesting that the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Levites were still around to take care of the temple, to do their various parts. To take care of the worship instruments, all of the building itself, and they just stuck right in and began to do their work. Once Hezekiah, gave up the green light.
yeah, the things that were established under Solomon moving forward, they still remained. They had just been sidetracked for a number of years. And once they had received direction from the Lord, they jumped back into it. Good point. So with that being said, we'll end there tonight. We'll look at the rest of Sennacherib and how he besieges Judah, Hezekiah's illness, and his relationship with Babylon next week. Thanks.